And welcome back to Scarred for Life, the podcast where we open up old wounds by looking back at the films that scared us as kids. I'm Terry.
And I'm Mary Beth.
And each episode, our special guest brings with them a movie that traumatized them as a child.
This week, our guest is author of My Dearest Darkest, which I have talked about previously on the show, Kayla Cottingham. Her most recent book, This Delicious Death, is out now. Welcome to the show!
Thank you so much for having me. I'm so excited to talk about horror and also this specific film and how much it did in fact scar me for life.
I'm so excited. And Mary Beth is like champing at the bit to get to it. But before we do jump into that deep end, let's start with your books. I'm in the middle of reading both. I'm listening to My Dearest Darkest on my trip, and I have download the other one for my Kindle. So
nice.
I'm in the midst of reading them. I haven't finished them yet, so no spoilers. But can you tell us, our listeners, a little bit about? Let's start with This Delicious Death. Can you tell us a little bit about that one?
Sure. So This Delicious Death is a YA sapphic horror novel about a group of girls who have undergone this physical change after getting sick during a worldwide pandemic. Obviously, no relation to the real world. Spoiler alert. Hugely related to the real world. But instead of dealing with the effects of, say, long COVID, they instead become flesh-eating ghouls. And after scientists are able to manufacture something called synflesh that allows them to eat synthetic human flesh, they're able to reassimilate into society. And since they've all just graduated high school, they decide to do what any good cannibal would do and go to a fictionalized version of Coachella. And things go decent for the first 5 minutes, and then they immediately kill and eat a boy by accident, and so it goes a little off the rails after that.
Just got to that point where they just feasted on one of the band members.
Yeah, it happens to the best of us, you know?
It does. And when I was reading this, I was like, boy, it's such a nice metaphor for our COVID response. But then I'm also thinking, boy, I would have been one that would have been hollowed because I have long COVID, and I'm just like, that would be really weird.
Yeah, I mean, you know, at least you don't have to actively eat fake liver all the time to live. So, you know, pros and cons.
Positives. Yeah.
Pros, cons.
Well, and I know Mary Beth is, because you've talked about this on the podcast before, you loved My Dearest Darkest, and I'm about halfway through it at this point. But you had a story about finding it, Mary Beth.
I did. I was halfway through telling it before we started recording, but I was in a Barnes & Noble just looking for, randomly looking, and this very cute queer woman comes up to me, and she goes, "Do you by any chance like queer horror?" And I look and I go, absolutely. I was and I was immediately clocked from across the Barnes & Noble, and she led me to your book. It was book of the month at Barnes & Noble or something. It was the release of the month, and she was like, "You'll love it." And she gave me all these comparisons. She was like, "It's The Craft, but with cosmic horror." And I was like, "Give me the book. Give it to me in my hands." And she was correct. I loved every minute of that book. It's gay. A lot of your work is very gay, and I love that.
Yeah,
it's
all of
gay.
it, in fact.
It's all gay, and it's so great to read about these stories of gay, complicated gay women who are also monsters, maybe sometimes. And it's just what drew you to, I mean, that's kind of a weird question, but what drew you to wanting to write about queer women in these scenarios, and where did your journey kind of start in wanting to write about these kinds of characters?
I had the sort of thing where I feel like horror chose me. I didn't choose horror. Where when I was originally querying My Dearest Darkest, it was pitched as dark realistic fantasy, which is not quite what I would call it these days. And at the time, I was doing that because even though it had a lot of horror elements, I didn't think that horror was going to be particularly marketable. And I also thought of horror as being it was a boys' genre. It was that's where Stephen King writes. It's, you know, that's horror's for guys, basically. And whatever long convoluted genre I have created is for me. And ultimately, over the course of the publishing process, it was no, this is horror, and horror is in fact a lot more flexible than I was giving it credit for. And it allows for a space to tell stories that I think you can't really tell in a lot of other genres, because you're given so much freedom in terms of what you can do, both in terms with the visceral reactions that you give a reader, and also being able to play with metaphor in a way that maybe wouldn't be quite as acceptable in a more mainstream, like, fantasy novel, per se, where I don't know if I could, like, in a romantic comedy, get away with, you know, girls who have just eaten a boy having, like, a cute little, oh no, our hands touched as we were reaching for the same heart or whatever. Like, it gives you a little bit more fodder to play with.
Well, as I was reading these books, I'm like, I wish when I was younger I had this kind of queer literature, because maybe I would have been more comfortable exploring my sexuality until I got way much older. But like, I think that's great. And I'm glad that you're focusing on YA, because I think that there needs to be more queer horror literature out there. And so it makes me happy.
Yeah, I love writing about teenagers just because their emotions are so raw and intense in a way that I think a lot of those experiences that you have as a teenager will always stick with you a little bit more than the ones that you have as an adult, because it's the first time that you're experiencing them as a teenager. It's your first crush. It's, you know, the first time that you experience maybe a person close to you dying. It's like all of those really, really intense emotions that being able to dive into those in a reflective way as an adult now makes YA super rewarding to write for me.
And I think people don't give YA enough credit for like what it is and the stories people are telling. Just because it says young adult does not mean these books are not dealing with like some crazy stuff. Like, I have read some very intense YA novels, and it's just like, just because they have that on there does not mean they're not worth, you know, diving into, especially in horror. YA horror is so good.
Mm-hmm. It's been having a moment.
Yeah, I feel very lucky to be in YA horror right now, because there are so many incredible books coming out where it's like you meet the most unassuming, charming 25-year-old, and then they've written like the most scary thing you've ever written. And it's like, oh my God, and this is for teenagers? Oh my God. It's the best.
Wait, so what are some upcoming YA horror books we should be on the lookout for?
So I got to read an early copy of The Spirit Bears Its Teeth by Andrew Joseph White.
Oh, I can't wait. I just requested that on NetGalley because he wrote Hell Followed Us Here, which was another one of like my fucking obsessions last year. And I've been so excited for the new one to come out.
Yeah,
it's good.
It bangs. It's so good.
I'm so excited.
Yeah, I'm like 2/3 of the way through it right now, and it's like all I think about.
Oh my God. Oh God. No, another hyper fixation for me. Oh, I can't wait.
And then another one I'm super excited about is Monstrous by Jessica Lewis, which is another queer horror for teens that's about this girl who basically is taken by this cult in this very white town where she and her family, she is Black, basically gets offered up as a sacrifice for this cult. Oh. And she survives that, and the god creature thing that they're trying to sacrifice her to basically is like, would you like to perhaps be terrible and kill and maim? And she's like, I would love to kill and maim and get revenge. And it's amazing.
Hell yeah.
So it's just like this very long, awesome revenge story of this girl who befriends this like weird snake creature god thing who kind of becomes like a pseudo father to her. It's amazing.
As you do.
Yeah, like you do. You know when you get adopted by a giant snake in the woods?
I wish I did. Honestly, I wish I had that experience.
I think that the support of a snake dad would have gotten me really far in life.
Amazing.
Not related to snake dads, I'm so sorry. I couldn't think of a good segue. So when did you know you wanted to be a writer?
I was one of those kids who, like, given a lined notebook, was like, well, it's time for me to create the most unhinged stories imaginable. So it would be like, you know, it would start off as a very sort of classic 5-year-old story of like, the dog goes to the park, but then it was like, the dog steals a baby. The dog takes the baby to a river, and you're like, what is going on with this kid? So I definitely I was into writing very early. It was sort of my way of getting a little bit of escapism, because am the youngest child by 10 years, so my siblings at that point were a lot older than me and did not want to deal with this like foolish infant running around the house. So I was like, great, I'm gonna make up some little stories about really, really weird stuff and it will work to entertain me. But I just kind of kept going all the way until I was, I think, 13 or 14 when I wrote my first like book, quote unquote. And just was cranking out manuscripts after that, and I queried like 4 or 5 times as a teenager.
Wow.
Not successfully, mind you, but I certainly gave it a shot.
I was gonna say, you still tried, which is awesome. Wow.
At one point, I remember being like, my book is a ripoff of Percy Jackson. I bet the best thing to do would be to query Rick Riordan's agent. And so me, age 14, was Googling, like, who represents Rick Riordan? And will they represent me?
That's amazing. Did you ever hear back? Did you ever get in touch with someone?
I did, like, find the person, but they did not respond to my query, which is not a huge surprise considering it was just thinly veiled fan fiction of a book they already represented.
That's amazing. That's amazing.
Oh, no. Wait, I love that. So you wrote a lot of fan fiction?
Yeah, it was definitely like, I wouldn't have called it fan fiction at the time. I would have been like, this is very original work, but it was mostly just me being like, Maximum Ride is the best thing I've ever read. I will now change everything about the appearances of the characters, but nothing about the plot itself. Amazing. Or like a little bit of Warrior Cats being like,
my God.
I love the idea of these cats getting into these like horrific visceral fights where they tear each other's guts out and stuff.
God, Maximum Ride was another big fixation of mine for a while. Is it James Patterson?
It is James Patterson. It was like early James Patterson before he like started tacking randos on.
Yeah. God, what a weird series of books.
Oh, James Patterson.
So bizarre. And it was so obvious when they started having ghostwriters because the plot was like fairly streamlined until you got to like book 4 and suddenly it was like, we have to go to the Arctic and save the penguins. And it was
that's
like...
That's when I stopped reading them, I think. I was like, nah, this is no longer the books that I like to read.
Yeah, I was like, this is dumb. I can't get behind this.
So, how did you get into horror? Like, what's your horror background? Have you always been a horror fan?
I think that it was sort of the same thing with when I was querying, where I thought horror was like, that was a boy genre. And so I didn't feel particularly welcome in the horror space, but that didn't stop me from being really into it in general, where I was a huge creepypasta fan. I had unfettered internet access, if that is not evidenced by the everything about me. And I went hog wild reading about the most deranged stuff. It'd be like, oh, Jeff the Killer, I love this. Like, yes, please tell me more about Slender Man. I would have nightmares for weeks and weeks and weeks, or like the Russian sleep experiment. So I was just consumed by reading these like online things because they were what was accessible to me as like a teenage girl sitting in my parents' house.
Yeah.
Because, like, the library wasn't super close by. My high school library was not particularly well stocked in any of the stuff I wanted to read. So I found, like, almost like a home away from home in creepypasta.
Whoa. How did you, like, stumble into creepypasta? What was, like, your gateway into creepypastas?
Oh, this is dark to admit. I was a huge Tumblr user.
Fuck yeah. I was too. No shame.
But I followed a couple of, like, horror-adjacent accounts, and they would post, like, creepypastas, and so I would just, like, go through the tag and read as many as I could in a night. And some of them were really good, and some of them were, like, those 2-word horror stories that's like, oh no, he said, it's here, the meatworm, and stuff like that.
It's a perfect story. That's it. That's all you need.
Yeah, it's flawless. I like did not make that up. There's a really wonderful tweet about that somewhere.
Because you were a fan of creepypastas, right, Mary Beth?
Oh yeah. I like read a lot of R No Sleep.
Yeah.
Which is like it's like creepypasta adjacent. It's like people telling stories like they're real, but it's kind of assumed that they're fictional, but they frame them like they're actually happening. And and my brother was really into them too. So we were like, I didn't like the images got to me. Like the creepy husky dog one.
Oh yeah.
Like any like creepypasta with like an image associated. There was like a Squidward one where it was like a haunted SpongeBob episode, and it's like it's like so over the top and graphic, but there's like a weird picture of Squidward's eyes really tiny with it, and that terrified me. So it was like if there was an image associated with it, I couldn't look at the picture because it would just be seared into my brain. But yes, I was a big reading the creepiest shit I could find on the internet type of gal for sure.
Yeah, and I missed all of that being a little bit older. Like I always wonder what it'd be like to be a teenager and finding stuff on the internet and playing around in that kind of sphere of like fiction, but also it feels real at the same time. Because I mean, I would have been like 20s, I guess, when like this was happening. So I kind of sad I missed it, honestly.
It was fun. It was like, and in a way, it was always using the sort of the classic horror device of, oh, this happened to a person I know, or this was...
It's basically urban legends.
To me 4 years ago, and it always made it feel so much more like pressing and intense, and so I thought that was always so cool. It was like, wow, your uncle was in the Russian sleep experiment where they started trying to, I forget even where that one went. I feel like it might have gone cannibalism, but I might just be always thinking cannibalism.
And like ripping people apart. It was just like all kinds of weird, fucked up stuff happening.
That's it, yeah. That's the stuff.
That's the ticket.
So you read a lot of creepypastas and you were in that space and you were writing. Did you watch a lot of horror movies growing up at all?
So I was a very reluctant horror movie watcher because so I have an anxiety disorder that makes a jump scare my ultimate nemesis. Like the second that a creature jumps out at me, I am like gone. I'm done. I've had enough. I like have to go sit down. And a lot of the horror that I remember watching when I was younger was like full of jump scares. And so I was immediately like, this is not for me. Even if I like the sort of darker storytelling and the elements of horror, I can't deal with jump scares. But I like would watch horror movies, but only in group settings and typically at sleepovers, which is where I wound up watching 30 Days of Night. But I never, like, was looking for horror movies. The closest I got was more, like, the classic cheesy TV stuff. So it was whatever was, like, available on Netflix. So I would watch, like, all of Buffy the Vampire Slayer, and I would watch, like, X-Files and stuff like that. And that was kind of as close as I got.
There are some really fucking scary X-Files episodes.
There are.
I'm not a big Buffy person, so I don't know. But X-Files is scary as shit. And I know that Buffy is very good. So, that's still... Are you into horror movies now, or you still can't, like, you're still kind of less of a horror movie type person?
It still kind of depends on the horror movie. So, like, if it's something like Hereditary, like, I loved Hereditary, and I love horror that has, like, kind of a comedy edge. So Megan was, like, my favorite movie I've seen in recent history. That was such a slay, honestly. Good for her. And... like, it really, what got me more into horror movies was more female-geared horror. So the ones that I did seek out as a teenager were things like Jennifer's Body and Ginger Snaps and The Craft and stuff like that, where I felt like I could relate a little bit more because I was like, I too am a feral teenage girl with incredible sapphic longing. I would love to watch this.
Oh, yeah. So I know that because you're talking about creepypastas, have you seen We're All Going to the World's Fair?
No, I have not.
That's one I think you should put on your list.
You should. It's not jump scare and it's not like traditional horror. It's weird and it's got like a really weird vibe in a good way. But it's you should definitely check that out.
I'll have to look that one up because I feel like I've heard the name in passing, but I haven't actually looked up what it's about. I do the classic thing where I like to look up a movie's plot on Wikipedia before I watch it to make sure that it's not too scary.
All of my friends do that.
Yeah, I don't think this one will get you. That there's really no jump scares in it. It's just but I think you'll relate to it because I know you were relating to it, Mary Beth, a lot because of the creepypasta element of it and living on the internet, right?
Yeah, growing up on the internet and also like being a kid who might be queer and you don't really know how to deal with that as a kid and you kind of just like look for people online and sometimes you don't always find the most savory of people online when you are searching for community. So, it's good. But then I also, since you read a lot. What are some of the scariest books you've ever read? Or, like, books you've, like, that have really scared you?
Ooh, this one's tough because I feel like a lot of the time I read horror and I just get really excited about it, where I'm like, this is so creepy, and it's more of an excitement reaction as opposed to a fear one. But cool. I do remember reading, oh my gosh, what is the title? It's The Diviners. Yes, so it's The Diviners by Libba Bray has this extremely creepy ghost story woven into it. And there's this moment near the beginning of the book where it's like the POV switches to a random character who is walking through this abandoned warehouse and is being terrorized by this ghost. And it like legitimately kept me up all night because I was so freaked out by it.
Whoa.
And then I also remember reading like Firestarter by Stephen King as a teenager, where I had a really a love of paperback horror that I could get for $5 at the bookstore. And so I remember like absolutely loving Firestarter. I thought that was the coolest book ever.
It's a good book. I like that one.
Okay, so we've talked about your creative work and your horror history, but Kayla, what movie did you bring with you today for us to discuss?
Yeah, so I brought 30 Days of Night, the 2007 horror masterpiece of so much blood and so many vampires in Alaska.
Yes. So I'll just read a brief synopsis of the film for everybody. In the far northern hemisphere, wow, that was hilarious, The far northern hemisphere, the small town of Barrow, Alaska, experiences a solid month of darkness every year. Though most of the residents head south for the winter, some townspeople remain behind. However, those that stay regret their decision when one year, hungry vampires descend on Barrow to feed.
Bum, bum, bum. All right.
Ta-da.
So take us back, Kayla. How old were you when you saw this? How did you see it? What about it scared you? Give us your horror story.
Yeah, so I, as I previously mentioned, was not the sort of kid who was looking for horror movies, but I was the sort of kid who loved to succumb to peer pressure. So I was at a classic all-girl sleepover, you know, the kind where everyone drinks a lot of soda, you reveal the most traumatic moments in your life, and then you slowly get lured into watching a horror movie. That was the scenario here. So we were in my friend Forrest's basement, and she was a big fan of going to, like, the Blockbuster and sort of looking through to just try and find the creepiest horror movies she could just to freak me out, and pulled this one off the new release sort of shelf. I think I was 13 at the time. And so we all gathered around the TV, and she was like, well, Kayla, you'll like this one because it has vampires in it. And this was also roughly around the time that I was super into Twilight. And I was like, amazing. Vampires, we're going to get kissing. We're going to get self-loathing. It's going to be amazing. And then that was not really what happened. So the movie starts, and I was like, Alaska, what a great setting. And it is a great setting because the whole concept of the 30 Days of Night is good. But also, boy, the snow makes for such a great place to put blood.
It sure does.
And there is so much of it in this movie.
There's so much blood in this movie.
So at what point were you all of a sudden going, oh no, this is not what I thought I was signing up for?
So the movie starts, and you're introduced to the main character, whose name is Eben with a B, which is something that I thought the whole movie his name was Evan, and that people just maybe had like a little bit of a stuffy nose as they were saying it. So they're like, well, it's Sheriff Eben. But it turned out that was just his actual Christian name. And he's like going around the town doing a bunch of cop stuff like you do in Alaska the day that everyone decides to flee your town before it goes into big night. And there's a scene where there's like this creepy figure shows up and starts killing dogs. And I am like a huge dog person. I usually am the one who Googles like, does the dog die in this movie? And it was right off the bat, just like, we are stabbing huskies. Like really close to the beginning of the movie. And I was like, I don't know if there's going to be as much kissing in this one as I want.
A little bit of necking, but not in the way that's any fun for you.
Yeah. Copious amounts of necking, yes.
There's no kissing. No, there's one kiss, but it's
I was
going to
say there's one poignant kiss at the end.
One poignant kiss at the end, and it's very sad, but there isn't, ooh.
That image of after the dogs have been killed and they find him, and there's the one that has, like, its jaw is, like, distended from it. It's like, that, like, lingers in my mind. It's like, oh, that is a horrific image right there.
Yeah, it's always rough. And then they do the fun thing in this movie where they capitalize not only on we're going to murder dogs really close to the beginning of the movie, but we're also going to have not one, but 2 creepy child scenes, which is such a classic horror movie thing. But at the time, as a person who didn't watch horror movies, I was like, oh, there's this little girl in the store. I hope she's okay.
Oh, no.
And then she looks up and reveals that she's, like, covered in blood and has the, like, sharp little teeth that the vampires have, and her eyes are black, and you're just like, no! And then later in the movie, there's, like, another little kid just, like, wandering shell-shocked.
I'm done playing with this one. Wanna play with me now? I can literally recite this stupid fucking movie, like, word for word. It's fucking embarrassing.
It's just like, oh my god, it's such a classic creepy kids shot. And then they have to try and take an axe to this kid, and it's so wild to watch. Because it's doing the, like, little kid skittering thing around, because she's a vampire at this point, and you're just like, no thank you.
But you made it through the entire movie at the slumber party?
I did, shockingly. There was... I think part of it is that because we were 13-year-olds, we were, like, continuously trying to sort of make jokes, even though we were super scared. So there's, like, one scene where there's, like, this bald, sort of buff vampire who acts as, like, the muscle for the group. Mm-hmm. And he, like, is revealed to have blood sort of from his nose all the way down his throat. And we kept joking of how it's like, oh, I gotta put on my little blood scarf before I go out in the Alaska cold. And the blood scarf joke went on and on and on. We played the hell out of it, but it was just like, oh, he's only killing that person because he's cold. He's got to warm up with a little bit of that nice cozy crimson.
That's incredible.
Oh, wow, that's amazing.
Wow.
Yeah, no, it's a truly thrilling film, and I think the thing with it is that it did kind of bring me into a zone of realizing I do like creature horror, because there's something unique about a creature feature that a lot of other horror doesn't have, where I think that creating a fun, fresh monster, especially out of something like a vampire, is hard to do. But they did it in such a way that I was very on board with the actual world building of the vampires in this universe.
Yeah, I do love the vampires in this, and I love the way that they're filmed. I love the kind of language they made up for them to have, so that they have that ability to talk. But also, they really did a good job of matching, I think, the artwork in the comic book that it's based on to, like, really kind of fit that tone. It surprises me on a rewatch just how close to that book in terms of, like, the look of the vampires are. They're frightening. And this was, as you mentioned, this did come out at a time of, like, Twilight, so people weren't thinking of vampires as these feral, monstrous creatures. It was more of a romanticized type look at them at that point. And this was a movie that just came out and just said, nah, man, we're just going to have everyone's throats torn out. Overhead shot of the entire town getting massacred. Like, it's chef kiss. It's
just all over the place. It's like that scene specifically where, like, the entire town is getting just, like, ripped apart it's so, I would almost call it camp. Because it's so much, but it's awesome.
I mean, we all know how much I love this movie. I am trying to be restrained in my excitement about talking about this movie, because I watched this movie, I think I was 15, and it was just out in Blockbuster, and it was like, my dad, when I would go to my dad's, we would, like, rent a movie and watch something, and he would let me pick it. And I picked this. I picked 30 Days of Night because I loved vampires. And I was like, this looks awesome and gross. And so we watched it, and I was just, like, immediately like, this is the best movie I've ever seen. Like, this is the best movie I've ever seen. Like, fuck hot vampires. Because I was a big hot vampire girl. Like, big Twilight person. Like, I made a t-shirt to the release of the last book. Like, I was a freak for Twilight. But then when I was like, wait, feral vampires? Wait, that's even cooler. And so I promptly made my parents take me to Borders. I bought the movie, and then I made my parents watch it with me that night, and then I watched it again that night in my room on my laptop.
Wow.
And then I watched it the next day. So I watched it 4 times in one weekend. And it was like my comfort movie that I would watch whenever like I felt sad. And it was a movie I showed all of my friends, and like no one really liked it as much as I did. They thought it was really gross, which is fair. But it was like this movie that I just watched all the time. And it was like a combination of loving how bleak it was and also thinking that Josh Hartnett was really sexy, but also Melissa George, who plays Stella. And I think it was just like, I was very horny and very into gross stuff. And I think it all kind of conflated onto this movie, which is really funny to say. But I still love this movie. Like, I understand criticisms of it. I know there's like, it's not a perfect movie, but I just think David Slade, right? That's the director who did Hard Candy as the director. Candy. And I just, I think he's a really good eye, like really good aesthetic, like good sense of like filming. And this movie is so stylish, and every kill is so fucking good. And everything about it, I think, is framed so well. I think it loses steam, and we can talk about it in the back half, but I just think like, it's just, you get that sense of like isolation and both like so much space and so little space, like that claustrophobia at the same time. And it's just like, so everything about it is just like terror inducing. It's terrifying.
Yeah, it's like every time they have to try and go from one building to another building, like it's heart-pounding tension. It is really well done, especially when you get the scene in the blizzard where they're trying to get to the like supermarket or whatever. That was terrifying to me.
Yeah, he's a really good visual director, and it's interesting because then he would, after this, go on to direct a Twilight Saga movie, Eclipse, which is wild to me.
I forgot that he directed.
I also totally forgot about
movie.
that. And honestly, Eclipse is the best one in my opinion.
Me too. I agree.
Knocked it out of the park, man.
Yeah, and he he's an interesting director because he did the Bandersnatch episode of Black Mirror, which was really good.
Oh yeah,
he came out swinging with Hard Candy, which is a wild film. He has a movie that has been in post-production for like, it feels like years. And I just don't know if with all of the like COVID stuff, if it just got kind of shelved. But he has like an adaptation of a book called Dark Harvest that was supposed to come out like 2 years ago, and it's still, who knows where it's at. And I love his work. I just wish there was more of it. You know, he does a lot of TV though. He's directed a lot of episodes of TV.
Yeah, he does a lot of TV.
But he has a very good visual eye, and I think he fits the aesthetic really well of what Steve Niles and Ben Temple-Smith, the comic creators, really kind of honed in on. I think that he really captured that aesthetic, both with the way Barrow looks, but also the vampires and just the overall feeling of it.
Yeah, there's a scene I always remember of the like lead vampire's girlfriend tries to go into this house where Eben is, and he like turns a sun lamp on her, and it burns a good chunk of her face and her body, and it's like it's very stark because they have the very white skin, but then it's just fully burned on one side. It's really good dramatic like visual effects that make it clear that you know, this is a bad scenario for them. But also, I think it's like, I don't know, they show that the lead vampire still cares about her.
Yeah.
I don't know. They like, because the vampires are not human, but they also still have like, I don't know, it's interesting. They're fun to watch.
Yeah,
they're very fun.
I think what this movie does a little bit better than the graphic novel does. The graphic novel goes into a lot. There's like more kind of lore going on in the graphic novel, and I think it was smart to cut it out of the movie because I think it's too much for the movie, just in terms of like certain characters, and it gets kind of touched upon in the sequel movie that was like direct to video and is not very good, but they do a really good job of honing in on these characters and adding characters to the story, like Billy, his sidekick, who ends up having this like really tragic story, but they really do a good job of building the dread in this movie before we even see a vampire. Like, we open up on Ben Foster as this incredible character. It's like a Cajun accent, which in the comic book, there's like Cajun characters, so it makes sense that they have the accent, but it doesn't really matter. Whatever. It's just like, that's too much information. Sorry. But he's walking towards the town, and it's already setting something up. Something really strange is happening. Then we have the satellite phones being, like, all the satellite phones being burned, the dogs being killed, the helicopter being torn apart, the power going, like, the power and communication going out. Like, all of these things are just like, what the fuck is going on? Like, something bad is coming, but I think they do a really incredible job of building that tension before having the big reveal, because the big reveal is the bird's eye view part, and it's so earned when they do this. That, like, they have all these horrifying moments. Like, they find Gus, the guy at the who runs, like, the satellite part of, like, the satellite building off in the middle of the snow. They find his head on a stake. And then
oh, God, right.
they see the shadows of the vampires on the horizon, and someone attacks their car, but they're like, what the fuck was that? And then when they pull into town, they hear the guns going off, and that's when everything starts going to hell. Like, the vampires are here, and we get this, like, incredible intro of Danny Houston, who plays the head vampire, mouthful of fucking shark teeth, but in a suit. These vampires are so cool, like you said, because they are like, they don't look like, but they don't look gothic, because it's not like well-dressed, like Interview with the Vampire stuff. It's like plain suit, and he's got these crazy ass nails and the teeth, and he says, they kill this family, and he puts his finger on a record and, like, makes this announcement to everybody. And then that's when we get this, like, horrific massacre scene of, like, things on fire, vampires jumping on everyone, blood spurting out of wounds. And it's just, like, this incredible opening sequence that I think is so amazing, but it's also to the detriment of the movie, because, like, it feels like it peaks so hard right there that it's, like, hard to keep up that momentum, I think, in this movie. And the end, whatever, we'll get there. But I think that they just build to this, and then when it's like has all this crazy music, and then it goes really quiet, and we just have the bird's eye view of people running and trying to shoot, and it's just like,
and all the blood splats on the white snow.
The blood
it's
on
so
the
good.
snow, and you're just like my stepdad, who's kind of hard to, like, get a reaction from, he was like, holy shit at that part, and I was like, I always felt so excited when he had a reaction like that.
Just like fist pumping, like, yes, vampires, let's go.
Like, see, I told you I always had a good taste in movies. He never ever said I didn't, but I just always felt pride when I found a movie the adults liked. Like, it was always so cool. But, like, god damn, that setup is so good. And, like, you get to know the inner workings of Eben and Stella's relationship, and that they're separated, and she's getting pressure from everyone to, like, stay. And we get the dynamics between the grandma and the brother, and the grandma has cancer and she's smoking pot. And, like, it's all of this really interesting character things are like speckled in without taking up too much space. And yeah, like, watching this now with, like, the whole, like, separated apart narrative is, like, a little bit cliche. But that's okay. It's 2007. We have to have a love element. And also, like, I did a talk a couple of years ago about, like, post 9/11 anxieties in this movie, because, like, as much as I love this movie, Eben's a fucking cop. Like, we got, like, Eben's a cop. And he likes being a cop. And yes, they are in Barrow, Alaska, but, like, it's just, like, he's a cop, and he is the hero of this, and he is the sacrificial lamb in this movie, and this movie does really reflect.
My man, given the chance to be a martyr, is like, let's go, I'm ready, let's do it again.
He really was.
That motherfucker had this much hesitation to sacrifice himself to turn into a vampire. He was ready. He was ready to be the hero that everyone talks about. Like, the hero that we see in, like, all of these, like, post 9/11 movies about the male martyr rescuing the women and children. Like, it is so much playing on those tropes. And, like, again, I love this movie, but I know exactly what it's doing with this. Like, he is a hottie. I love him, but I also know that what his character is functioning as this, like, male martyr character who is like, save the oil! How dare they destroy the pipeline! America's gold!
They should have just, like, put, like, an eagle screech over that.
America! Fuck yeah!
And it's just, like, you know, it's so obvious what's kind of happening here in terms of, like, like the weird outsiders who can't speak English come in and invade this like small American town that has an oil pipeline that is, like, very important resource, and there's a cop that has to protect, and the manly men have to protect, and the woman can't be a cop. It's just, like, there's some very late 2000s gender dynamics going on here, and that
Well, I will say, I mean, Melissa George's character is a fire marshal, and she carries a gun. Like,
Oh yeah,
she
and she was a cop too. She was a cop before she left. Like she was a cop there, I think, before she
I
left.
feel like at some point in the movie, everyone is a cop. Like it's like the very first scene, and they walk into, it's like the grandma's in there, the brother's in there, and they just are all hanging out, being like, another day of coppery, I suppose.
Yeah, like we were gonna play a board game and like check the computers and work as the police, like the police station, and like yeah, I guess you could argue that it's not the same in Alaska, but you're still cops, like. And we see him give, like, parking tickets for stuff, like, dumb shit. And you're like, come on, brother. Like,
I love that he's like, that makes him feel part of the town. I'm like, can you just invite him to dinner? Why are we giving him a citation to make him feel like part of the town?
And, yeah, like, it's definitely got some very regressive politics going on. And, you know, yeah, some could say I shouldn't read that hard into it. But it's also pretty obvious. Like, outsiders destroying pipeline setting town on fire, cop man saves day. But the vampires are still really cool.
But vampire, very cool.
Very cool. Well, you talked about the way that it builds dread, and I would say that the first half of this movie is the best part. The little seeing kind of how everything that's happening is sort of like clicking into place with Eben, where he like they first find the pile of burnt satellite phones that they had that have been stolen, and he's like, well, that's strange. And you know, the Billy is like, oh, maybe it's just kids, you know, pranking. He's like, they would have been left a note like, fuck you. Like there's like that moment, and then we get to town and the dogs are slaughtered, and he's just like, there's something going on. But just the way that it sort of like is in this very isolated area already, the vampires are even more slowly isolating them. And it's like all of these little locks that are clicking into place until the moment that, you know, the big shot of the town or whatnot. But I love the beginning part, and I forgot how tense it is. And you're just like, something bad is happening. You can feel it in your gut this entire time. But the movie is very restrained in this early part. The only thing we have is the scene-eating Ben Foster, the stranger, who's just like, you talk about camp. His character is the campiest part of this movie. He's just like,
oh my gosh, just
chewing.
him like handcuffed after being like, I'm gonna pick the lock with this like Parcheesi piece or whatever. It's like, yeah, go off, King. Go, sure.
Give me a bowl of raw hamburger.
Oh, yeah.
I was like, what the fuck? He's like, you don't give me what I want to eat. We don't. And he starts like having it like making a scene, and Evan's like, howdy, partner. No. And he's such a weird character, but I love that because I think he has to be that weird to make him even scarier. You know what I mean? Like, he's so different. You're like, how the fuck did you end up here? Like, how did you get to this place? Like, you could not be any more different than like what we are used to here. And like, that is a red flag because we are literally like at the top of the world. So like, what is going on here? And he's like telling him like, it's again, this movie falls out of horror tropes. Like the creepy guy, like he's like the harbinger of death and is like sharing like their fate, and they're like, shut the fuck up. But it's still, the way it's framed and the way it's done is really creepy. Like the
bit when he's like, you know, Eben is trying to like ask him what's going on, and he's like, I don't talk to dead men.
Yes! Oh, it was I love that line.
That was, I got chills at that point. I was like, oh, we're in danger, ladies.
You in danger, girl. Ugh. And then like you said, it picks up steam really quickly, and we have like everyone, like all of the survivors gathering and like trying to figure out what to do and not understanding and being like, they're all on PCP. And it's like, no, buddy. Like,
he's
like, we don't have them on PCP, and they're like, I don't think it's PCP. And then like, because we now have like our little cast of characters. We have like Eben, we have his brother, we have Stella, and then we also have one of the pipeline workers, one of these women that we see earlier in the film. We have
who I think was going to have a threesome. Yeah,
there was going to be a threesome at one point, and a vampire takes away one of the guys. Good for them. There's the diner owner, there's a man, the operator of the helicopter, and his father with dementia. And then there is the guy, an older man, I forgot his name, but So there's like a very small group of survivors who are now banding together. And as we start like going through their journey of like being hidden in attics, it slows down a little bit. And it's a little, it loses momentum a little bit, I will say. And I listened to the commentary and David Slade goes, yeah, we kind of lost track of how days had passed, and we kind of fucked up the how much time had passed. So, oops. And he openly meant, because you don't really get a sense of like time passing in this. Like, it's like, all of a sudden it's been like 2 weeks, and it's very confusing. And he was like, yeah, we didn't. Oops. And so it was funny just to hear him go like, oh well, we messed that one up, but it's fine.
Who among us hasn't looked at their timeline and gone, whatever.
Oh yeah,
we'll figure it out.
How much time has passed? I don't know, 14 days. Does that make sense? That's fine. Don't worry about it, guys.
Yeah, I forgot that they were actually going through an entire month until like the 18 days came on the screen, and I was like, oh yeah. We are going through this whole entire time, because this is only the second time I've seen this movie. I saw it once in the movie theater when it first came out. I would have been 26 at the time, and I loved it up until the end. And I still think, because like I feel like the most of it is very grounded. It's very, yes, the monsters are fantastic at parkour, and they're just flopping around all over the place. But like, it feels really grounded in these characters and in this place that I grew up in Alaska. And so like, it felt sort of like this very real down to earth thing. And then all of a sudden he's shooting up vampire blood and turning into a vampire. And I'm like, okay.
That was such a wild choice, because it truly, like, the word distraction is breathed around this man, and he just jumps up. He's like, yes, let's do it. Let's go. And then it gets to the end.
Hero. I must be a hero.
It's like, oh no, she's trapped under the car and the oil is coming. And I'm like, and your reaction is to, okay.
Shoot up some vampire blood and...
Let's go. With like no knowledge of whether or not that's going to do anything.
Knowing full well that, like, I mean, he says, at one point, like, oh, that people are retaining their humanity a little bit. I'm like, okay, but you don't know what the difference is going to be if you're shooting up blood versus getting bit. Like, what is happening here? You could just immediately turn on your people and slaughter them.
Yeah.
That's the only part, and it's still on this rewatch. It's the only part that I do not like about this movie, because it reminded me that this is based on a comic, as opposed to, and that's nothing to say bad things about comic, but it felt like it felt like jumping the shark a bit in terms of the more down to earth, very grounded relationship, and it almost felt like a Deus Ex Machina moment. It's like, how are we going to get out of this? I'm going to shoot up some vampire blood and turn into a superpowered vampire and kill the lead guy, and then everyone else will flee. And I'm like, I don't think that was the way to go. But other than that, I think I really enjoyed this movie on seeing it in the movie theater, and I don't know why I haven't watched it as much since then. So I was really glad to be able to revisit it, because I think, as someone that lived in Alaska, and I lived in the southern part, I lived near Anchorage. It's we do get weird times of day where it's like, in the summertime, the sun would set about midnight and come up at like 4 or 5 in the morning. And then in the reverse time, it'd be like kind of the opposite. And so like seeing kind of like the isolation of Alaska, as someone that lived there for 8 years, it was really kind of cool to see. And I think it's a great setting. I am a huge fan of isolated horror. Isolated horror is my favorite. The Thing, or like being underwater in like an underwater laboratory like Sphere or something, or even in this one, being just separated from society where there's nowhere to go. It's that kind of setting that it's my favorite.
I'm also a huge fan, which, as you're saying that, I realize I did that with This Delicious Death, where they kind of get stuck in this like canyon, or valley, I mean, and there's like one road in or out. So it is kind of that same sense of being enclosed and being trapped, and it worked really well in this movie, especially when they do, like, as much as the scenes of them hiding in the attic are very like, where's the action? It also it adds that sort of confining sense that is really effective.
Mm-hmm.
Well, and I think this movie is so nihilistic. It like the ending kind of feels like you're betraying it a little bit. And I get that you're trying to follow a comic, the graphic novel and everything, but it just like, we have the scene where they watch they're in the attic. They watch this young girl who's being sent out as bait, who is screaming for help, and they're his Evan's brother said, "I know her. Like, I've known her since we were kids." And he's like, "Don't go out there. Look on the roof." And there's vampires on the roof, like waiting for people to come out to help her. And she goes, "There's no one left," which means like they've been keeping basically pets to tease people out. And when she's begging for God, this the famous line like, "God, no God," and then they feast on her, and it's like there is such an incredibly nihilistic streak in this movie. It's so fucked up. It's just like no one is safe, and yeah, like our hero dies, but it's like the sacrifice, so it's not the same thing as like.
It's romanticized almost.
They left her under the car with the kid. They survived when the sun came up and she burned to death, and now they have to live with their choices. But maybe that's just me being a sad bitch. But it just feels like more authentic to like the rest of the story in terms of like what has been happening and how like we've been watching people get picked off in the saddest of ways. Like when the guys with the man with dementia runs out of the house looking for his wife, and his son is trying to find him in a snowstorm and they can't. And it's just like, and Billy killing his wife and kids, but then the gun jamming and he's by himself. It's just like tragedy after fucking tragedy. And then having this ending, it is like, again, very 2007, like there's hope, even if there's like bad things happening. And it's like,
yeah, the ending scene of them like sitting on the hill watching as the sun finally rises again after a while, and you're just like, oh, okay, this is very Hollywood. This is very like American storytelling of like, we have to make sure that there's still like a nugget of hope at the end of what has been a very nihilistic film.
Yeah, and I know that like the script went through a lot of revisions in terms of like with Steve Niles came up the concept of it, was pitching around, and then when it finally got picked up, then they brought in other people to like tinker with it, and then more people tinkered with it, and by the time David Slade was on, he tinkered with it a little bit. They went through a couple different drafts and revisions from different writers, and I do think that there is a little bit of disjointedness in the final script of this. I think the script is probably the weakest part of this. I think most of it, of what really works for me, is the visual storytelling and the cinematography, and the acting I think is really good in this too. And I think that sort of elevates what is kind of a patch-worthy script in some ways. And I do think, especially on this rewatch, I do think that you can kind of feel that this has a number of different hands in the pot in terms of like trying to make it close to the novel or close to the graphic novel, or trying to like honor it but not be as close to it. And I think there is a little bit of headbutting in terms of the way that the script kind of came together based on all the different drafts of it. But I still think it's a very effective movie. And what I really enjoyed, again, kind of going back to the isolation, I love Alaska's a weird place. There are people there, especially like where I live, there was a lot of military families because there's a base, and that's why we were there. My dad was stationed at the at Elmendorf base in Alaska. So you would have like people that either have lived there their entire life, or you have people that are going there to escape. Like even they say in the movies, like, a lot of us came to Barrow for that freedom, like because you're so isolated, you're so away from everyone that if you're running from a dark past, or if you're trying to like hide, it's the perfect place to go. And so there's a lot of weird people that were up there, either people that were there briefly, or people that are hiding from someone, or people that moved up there and just love the outdoors. But there are parts of Alaska that are so isolated. I remember there's a story. Have you guys ever heard of Whittier, Alaska?
Sounds familiar. You'll have to say what it's known for, and then I'm sure that'll trigger it.
So it's a town. It's a sleepy town on the west side of the Prince William Sound, and it is the only way to it is either by sea or through a tunnel in a mountain. That is the only way through. At some points of the day, the tunnel is one way only, so you can only get through it at certain times. And at night, it closes up. So if you're stuck outside of it, you're not getting into town because the mountain is closed. And everyone pretty much lives in a 14-story building that was a former army barracks. And it looks kind of like an aging hotel. And so, like, everyone pretty much lives in this hotel.
I've heard of this weird thing.
It's so wild to me, but that's what you get here. I'm sharing in chat the article link where you can kind of see the hotel. But this is basically, like, that's basically where everyone lives. And there's, like, a post office, and there's, like, a a good store and everything, but everyone lives in this one building that is so isolated that you can either only have to get to it from sea or hope that you can get through that tunnel because it closes. It's so wild to me, but this is typical like Alaskan life, particularly as you get further north in it. And I think that Barrow, Alaska in this really kind of captures that same feeling so incredibly well.
And it's a real place. My grandpa's been there.
Yeah.
Because he is in the Navy. And I was like, wait, you've been to Barrow, Alaska? He's like, yeah, do you know what Barrow, Alaska is? I'm like, do I know what Barrow, Alaska is?
I am intimately familiar with Barrow, in fact.
I could draw you a map of Barrow, Alaska.
Instead of like those people who go to Forks, Washington for tourism stuff, you're just like, we're heading up to Barrow, let's go.
I thought about it before I have, but I'm like, ooh, that's a pain in the ass. And there's like nothing, it's not really like, there's nothing there. It's like, why? There's no reason to go, but it's just kind of,
I mean, you could go to the bar and try to order some like raw meat and...
Who is this bitch? All like the people that are there are like hardened outdoorsmen or like oil refinery workers, and you're like, get out.
And I do think because like the Barrow in this movie is a very heavily fictionalized version of the Barrow because it's like they
I'm sorry, you're telling me that they don't typically have vampire attacks up there?
Well, I mean, even that aside, like they getting out is not as dire as they make it seem like in this, where it's like she has to get to the airport on time. That's not true, but it is. There's this quote from Cold Adventures in the World's Frozen Places, where they say, Barrow, like most communities in Alaska, looks temporary, like a pioneer settlement. It is not. Barrow is among the oldest permanent settlements in the United States. Hundreds of years before the European Arctic explorers showed up, Barrow was more or less where it is now, a natural hunting place at the base of a peninsula that pokes into the sea.
Oh, shit.
So like, it's there's a lot of history with it, and I think it's actually changed its name to honor the Inuits that live there.
Cool.
Oh, okay.
I cannot pronounce this word, but yeah, it's so far up north that it's amazing. It's amazing to think about how like isolated, how wildernessy, how kind of, well, last frontier Alaska really kind of is. And it still is that way in a lot of places today. It's wild.
There was something I was going to add about that because, okay, there was an issue I remember because in the graphic novel, Eben's last name is different, and it's a specifically, I think, Inuit last name, and they change it in the movie to something more white. So there is definitely some like not so great also erasure of like the Inuit culture that they were trying to talk about a little bit in the graphic novel. So just I remember seeing that somewhere and being like, oh, that's kind of gross. Like you cast a hottie like Josh Hartnett, but then you change the last name, and it's like, oh, I don't like that. I'm not a huge fan of that choice, but just wanted to acknowledge the indigenous stuff that they definitely like whitewash a lot of Barrow. Like they show you some images of like, look, this person looks like an Inuit person, right? They've got a fuzzy hood, and it's just like, okay, so they whitewash a lot of Barrow, I think, in this movie.
Yeah, because there's in 2010 the census said there were 4,212 people living in the city, and the racial makeup was 60% Alaskan Native, 16% white, 0.9% African, 8.9 Asian, 2.3 Pacific Islander. But like the majority of it, the people that live there are Inuits, Alaskan Native. And so it's I always find it interesting when people take that subject and then just whitewash everything about it, because you're right, Mary Beth. Aside from like I think we see like an Asian person and like a couple people of color, it's mostly white. And that is, it's not the truth of Barrow.
Yeah.
But that happens so many times in movies.
I know. It's a bummer, but I wanted to acknowledge it.
Yeah, absolutely.
Is there anything else you want to hit on before we wrap up?
I guess one sort of funny outcome of watching this movie is that I did develop like a very intense fear of vampires.
Oh, okay.
Oh!
As a 13-year-old, I was very afraid of vampires after this. And I have pictures of it. I slept with an actual stake, like a wooden stake, underneath my pillow for a full calendar year after watching 30 Days of Night, even though in the mythos of the movie that would do nothing. I convinced myself. So I also stole this stake. I went to Home Depot with my mom, and I I was like, I need to protect myself from vampires, and I have to take the initiative here, because I was like, Mom, I need a steak. She's like, you absolutely do not. That's deranged. So I just slipped it into my backpack and stole it from the Home Depot, and then I like colored the end of it with a red Sharpie to look like it had blood on it, so it seemed a little bit more badass. But I like legitimately slept with a steak under my pillow for a full year after watching this movie.
Kayla, you and I would have been such good friends, because like when I was a kid, all I would get from horror movies is, and I've mentioned this in the podcast before, is how to kill monsters. I would be like, okay, well, if this monster comes, I know that this is what's going to be effective for it. I had one of my friends, because I was obsessed with vampires growing up. I had one of my friends who was Catholic. He went to his church and got me a vial of holy water that I kept by my bed in case I wanted to, like, I needed to splash it on some vampire. Like, I get you. It's funny that you stole a steak from Home Depot and hide it under your pillow, but that's behavior that I had too as a kid. Like, you'd tell me like what kind of creature up against, be like, oh, well, you can kill it with this, and this. I know because of this movie and this movie and this movie. So I completely understand. I think that
kids are more ready for the apocalypse than anyone else.
Absolutely.
There's something about that mindset of being a child where you're like, I have very little power, but you know what I do have? The ability to sleep with a steak under my pillow or get a vial of holy water. I will take control of my situation and I will come out victorious.
I wanted to be a vampire, so I was like, yeah, I wanted it. I was a weirdo and was like, well, not at this point at seeing this movie. I think I was a little too old for that. But
this came out sort of like, again, in that Twilight time frame. You said you were a fan of Twilight. Did seeing this affect any of your like relationship to the vampires in that movie or in that series afterwards at all?
Well, I knew that. So I actually didn't like the vampires in Twilight as much as I liked the werewolves. I was very much like a Team Jacob.
I was going to say Team Jacob.
Wow.
Yeah.
Team Jacob
and so I was like, well, this is just further proof, isn't it? This is the real stuff. This is what Edward would be doing if Stephenie Meyer weren't a coward.
Yes.
But like I still loved the series, and it made it almost like a sort of thing where I was like, I do want to kiss a vampire, but it will need to then step 3 feet away from me.
No necking.
No, absolutely not. No.
Hey, my face is up here. Get away from that.
Yeah, I'm sorry. Please stop staring at my jugular. It's eyes up here.
Eyes up. Eyes up.
Just get like a choker necklace that say, my eyes are up here with 2 arrows.
Yes. Oh my God. That'd be amazing.
Oh,
Mary Beth, were you, what team were you on?
Jacob.
We're
No,
all
not Jacob.
Jacobs.
No, I wasn't Jacob. Jacob. I was Edward. I wanted to be I wanted vampires. They were like so hot, and it was just ideal. I wanted to be in the vampire family. I wanted to live forever and be hot.
And have your skin
very
sparkle
valid.
like diamonds.
Yeah, fuck. Why not? Fuck. It's fine with me. Whatever.
I feel like there was maybe a plot point with the werewolves where they were maybe functionally immortal. Maybe not. There was some kind of thing I feel like introduced.
Yeah.
To try and make it seem like Jacob and Renesmee could be like dicking around forever in the same way that her parents were. Yeah. Which, wow.
Stephenie
Great
Meyer
one
lost
stuff.
Lost the plot. I thought, oh man. Twilight.
Even at age 13, I read the last Twilight book and was like, man, this is garbage.
Yeah.
Yeah.
They really kind of fell off there for a bit, or all the way.
I would have rather they sat on a snowy hill and watched the sunset rise and have Edward and Bella turn to ash very slowly.
Also, honestly, it would have been even better if Eben was like, I'm your leader now, and like led the vampire gang. You know what I mean?
That would be sick.
Because they all fucking ran off. Like, they're not dead. Like, they're so, like, he didn't really like do much. Like, in the grand scheme, if you like think about the scale of it, like he only killed one of them.
Got punched a lot.
Yeah, he just like punched the whole head out of one of them, which is an incredible frame right out of the graphic novel, which is I'm obsessed with. But like they all leave, and like
yeah,
it's
I
a whole
don't know why
fucking
they all
society
leave.
of vampires. Like Well, because the sun's coming up, and I think they're like, I am not equipped to handle this, and I do kind of vibe with that. They're like, nah, we're good. Like,
yeah, they're like, you know what? We had our 30 days of night. We're headed home. See you guys.
yeah, like whatever. I'm done. Like, he was a dick anyway.
Oh, they could have
like,
taken
Marla,
2 more minutes and murdered everyone.
yeah, you know, I don't know. They don't.
Marlo and his stupid suit are gone. Let's go.
Marlon is stupid.
Finally, someone killed that guy.
Yeah.
Ugh, what a movie. What a picture. Then Terry, how many bird's eye view massacres out of 5 do you give 30 Days of Night?
Iconic. That, you know, that's the thing. When I was watching it again, I remembered precisely 2 things from it. I remembered the overhead view, and I remember the twist. Well, not the twist, but him injecting the blood into himself. And those are the 2 things I remembered about seeing this movie.
When he said that, I thought that was so hot. What's wrong with me? I can smell your blood, and I was like, sorry.
I love that. Oh my god! But so it was kind of fun rewatching this for, again, probably the first time since I saw it in the movie theater. I think it holds up really well. I have some issues with the more comic booky natures that get introduced, and I do think the first half is a lot stronger than the second half. But I really enjoy this one. I think the vampires in this are just absolutely fantastic. I love the way their nose, it made them almost look a little feline, and their screeches and stuff was very animalistic. It just, I don't know. This is like, if I want vampires like this. I want terrifying, feral, not like brooding in a castle, life is so horrible kind of vampires. I want the ones that are just gonna fucking tear your throat out and do parkour all over town. Like, give me that. So I don't know, for me,
was fun.
I love they're just like jumping, wow, just jumping.
I feel like if you're a vampire, what is the point of being a vampire if you can't do a sick flip every now and again?
Exactly.
You know?
Yeah, fun.
Exactly.
Why not? If you can jump off a goddamn roof and bounce around, like, why wouldn't you do it? It's cool.
Shit, I'd be flipping left and right.
I know. Just,
why walk?
who's that bitch flipping down the street? That's just that vampire Mary Beth. She's really excited about being able to just flip all the time.
Well, and I think about like Underworld too, where Kate Beckinsale just walks off the building and goes flying down to the ground. I'm like, yes, this is.
That's the first R-rated movie I ever saw.
Oh, was it really?
Was, I think, like the second Underworld movie, which I watched without the context of the first Underworld movie. So everything seemed so wild.
So lost. What's happening? Who are you people?
I was like, who is this guy? Wait, he's a vampire? No, wait, he's a werewolf? It's okay, well, everyone's wearing leather. It's skin tight. I'm bi. I'm having a great time.
That's basically, I mean, that's it. That's all you really needed. Is just like, I'm having a good time. I'm just watching some butts.
I mean, that's a good bi movie between Scott Speedman and Kate Beckinsale. Like,
I was eating
There's
well.
something for everyone.
Ooh.
Yeah. I can imagine, because I was like closeted at that point, and I'm like, ooh, Scott Speedman, he is so cute. And just like his rip. Yeah. Anyway, this is not an underworld discussion, but good lord,
it deserves a shout out though. Another incredible piece of vampire media.
And Bill Nighy in that as like the vampire. Oh, so good. Anyway, this movie, I think it's a 4. I think it's 4 bird's eye view massacres out of 5 for me. What about you, Mary Beth?
So, like, from a critical adult perspective, it is a 4. But like in my heart of teenage hearts, it is a 5. So we'll split the difference and do a 4.5, with that half star being a bunch of nostalgia on how much. Like, I was fully prepared when I thought I wanted kids to name my child Eben. Like,
I respect it. I really do.
I am telling you, this movie changed a feral creature for this movie when I was a child. Like, ready to name children after that. Like, what? And when I would tell boyfriends, psychotic behavior. Don't ever do that, anyone. Don't tell a boyfriend what you know how to name your babies, especially when you're like in your like. Don't do that. Psychotic behavior. They were like, "You mean Evan?" I'm like, "No, Eben." And
no, I do not.
No. Yeah. So this movie just like occupies a very weird space in my brain, and I love it so much, as I have talked about ad nauseum all the time. And I'm so glad that we got to talk about it today and talk about how good it is and also its problems, because it's also like super important, not just it's technical, but like weird indigenous erasure stuff that like people don't really think about. But it was just awesome to be able to chat about this. So 4.5 bird's eye view massacres for me. And then Kayla, you have the fun word. how many Bird's Eye View Massacres out of 5 do you give 30 Days of Night?
I would give it maybe 3.5 Bird's Eye View Massacres.
Hell yeah.
But I would give it 5 out of 5 Blood Scarves.
Hell yeah.
Just needs to stay warm in the Alaskan cold.
She's gotta get cozy.
I love that. Well, thank you so much, Kayla, for joining us to talk about 30 Days of Night. Where can our listeners find you? And the floor is yours. What do you have to plug and what can you share?
Yeah, so you can find me on Instagram and on Twitter, just under Kayla Cottingham. My Twitter handle is peculiarity, like the beverage, and I'm KCotCan on Instagram. You can buy my books wherever books are sold. If you're looking for an indie to get them from, I do signed copies from All She Wrote Books in Somerville, Massachusetts.
Oh, cool.
And yeah, feel free to follow me to hear more weird takes about things that I did when I was 13, like stealing steaks from Home Depot.
Hell yeah.
So listeners, you've heard from us. We want to hear from you. What was your experience with 30 Days of Night? You can send us an email at scarredforlifepodcast@gmail.com. Or you can reach out to us directly on Twitter. I am at MB McAndrews.
And I'm McGailey Dreadful.
And of course, don't forget to follow the podcast on Twitter at Scarred Podcast.
And please don't forget to review, rate, and subscribe. And if you want to help support us, we do have a Patreon.
Thank you to Eric Power for our artwork. Thank you to Sean Keller for our music. Thank you everyone for listening. Please stay safe out there, but most importantly, stay creepy.
And until next time.